Bonjour, monsieur. So, welcome all of you back once again, ladies and gentlemen. And to be honest, I go to be completely honest and transparent with you guys and say that, yes, I am going to say on the record, La Marseillaise is probably the greatest national anthem that ever existed. And you may be thinking that's biased because I absolutely love La Marseillaise. I love the history behind it. I love the patriotism of it. I love its message, its course. I love just its influence across. Well, you have to understand the French Revolution was so incredibly effective in how widespread it was all across Europe during the I was either the 17th or 16th. Well, it was more sort of like 18th century, as I think, from as far as I can remember, until how it spread into Prussia, it spread to Russia, it spread to the UK, it spread basically all over Europe, and it pretty much led to the Napoleonic Wars, and of course the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, then to the consort of Europe, and then through France's two other revolutions, which finally saw the end of their royal lineage. And then, of course, we fast forward to some 300 years later, and what we actually want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is I want to sort of like give you guys a few different examples of just sort of what impact just this anthem alone has. And you may remember a couple of days ago when I talked about how the Welsh national anthem was literally was first sung in a pub during the late 19th century, and how it became so popular that it actually reached national status. And what I want to also go through today, ladies and gentlemen, is just a few specific examples, and then we'll see what happens, because this should just clear everything up and just about how, because this was recommended to me, but I think there are a few other things we could go through. So some things I want people to point out is that the date, the 20th of November 2021, this is when lockdowns had virtually ended. Even by this date, COVID was still somewhat problematic, but people were more brave and quite a lot more were vaccinated by this point. And in this match against France against New Zealand, they are about to actually play the national anthem of La Marseillaise. A shorter version, yes, but look at the size of the stadium, and probably with what's about to happen next.
L'équipe de France, la Marseillaise.
Ladies and gentlemen, in honor of l'équipe de France, la Marseillaise.
And listen, guys, from the word go, the second it started, everybody began. There was no waiting or pausing, or anybody had to let anybody else lead everybody into song. Everybody got into it. That's the sort of the influence that something like this has. And can you ever remember any other time when people just got involved and they didn't need any other provocation? That's the sort of fear of influence that La Marseillaise truly has. I mean, I'll just do it one more time. like I said, nobody needed a queue, nobody needed permission. They just got on with it. And that is fantastic. It's fantastic that they didn't need provocation. So, among other things I kind of wanted to point to as well is that you may remember this, ladies and gentlemen, and this is just more of a specific example of French Parliament. And I'm going to have to just check very quickly about how 8 years ago, so this was after, I bet this is when after then President Francois Hollande had addressed Parliament, members of the National Assembly, which, yes, actually, to be honest, with this actually seeing the National Assembly for the very first time, the French Parliament, it's very well kept, I must admit. Well, then again, it probably had to be. This is the throne of all government in France, and how Hollande basically almost sits almost as though he's actually on trial in what is essentially designed to be something of an amphitheater in many ways. But again, you're talking about every single politician from all divides in France at this very moment accumulated in the National Assembly in Paris, and Hollande, well, just stands, I should say, rather by himself, and without knowing overtly too much about French politics. Well, there are some things I probably could say, but considering this happened 8 years ago, it's probably not even worth doing so. But again, they're going to take part in La Marseillaise, and unlike something like God Save the Queen or the King, this is also, just as we saw before, something where there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever. So, here we So again, the actual relevancy of showing this is to possibly to go with the idea of the fact that the pitch, the tone, everything, it wasn't designed to sound in any other way, and that might sound just as it is for the sake of a national anthem goes. But again, there wasn't even a moment where people were sort of out of tune and just everybody was involved in this, which is possibly more cause of French national duty, you may say. But also remember, it's to never again be overthrown by tyranny, to never have one man become another person's master. It's about liberty, equality, and fraternity. And it's something that probably, maybe the dynamic of maintaining that sort of patriotism is probably maybe quite a lot harder to do in France than it probably would be to do in England. Because in England, there's a very clear position where you can be. You can be sort of in favour of the royal family, but you could also mostly be in favour of Parliament. Some people would say that between the issues of these two things, it's too black and white, but there are quite a lot of very subtle grey areas that unfortunately I sort of fall into as well, is that I like the idea of status and position, but I don't think that sort of status and position should ever be given to a very, very small population of people, i.e., no person should have the sort of influence, the wealth, the lack of actual problems that millions of people within their homeland actually should face. For there was a big thing they mentioned on the news a couple of days ago, relevant for the sakes of this, and just to do a comparison to, like when it comes to, like, things like politics and stuff like that, is the fact that the French have never at any point, if a load of people from the French bourgeoisie actually came to live in England for several years, and they knew a lot about English society and the relationship they have with government and with the royal family, or rather what both divides and both sides to all these sorts of things. Actually, I reckon people will be coming away with a very different impression of it. Because I could go on for many, many hours about the differences and sort of how people are trying to masquerade that actually there's a much bigger bugbear going on with things like Prince Harry and Meghan and Prince Andrew and stuff like that. But I don't really feel like I need to do that, because the relevancy for this video was to focus on Le Marseillaise as sort of not just embedded in as a national anthem, but as a form of like national status as to what it means and what it might possibly mean in the hearts of thousands of French people. And again, you have to understand things like this, because there's a video that comes under here about Italy's current prime minister, who's actually greeted with the song Bella Ciao at a convention. And you have to understand, I don't quite remember what her name was, but Italy's prime minister is renowned as being basically a Nazi. Now, maybe you might argue that's kind of like, that's a pretty bold thing to say. However, you would also have to understand is that probably even the eyes of the Italians, they would even say that they would be calling basically their prime minister a borderline Mussolini impersonator. Because I've heard some stories about this, and you know what they said, they thought that Berlusconi was Berlusconi was something of like a tyrant, as like head of the mafia, but no, she takes the cake there. So that's probably just going to be on one side. So we sort of took a look at what like the average French citizen would possibly do in circumstances where, even in the context of sporting events through rugby or football, would probably have towards it. And then we go a little bit further. We talked about a sense of national duty and sort of like a sense of status. But now we're going to go into a little bit more, because there is one more stage I wanted to explore this, and that is to the relation it has around the world, or specifically to its neighbour in England. They say that France is the master of the continent, or rather ruler of the continent, and they call England the ruler of the seas. But you also have to, I'm going to have to give some context for this, ladies and gentlemen, because I remember this very, very well. This was, I think, after like a month or 6 weeks after the terrorist attacks in Paris. As a result, an entire football match had to be called off, and when several terrorists had invaded a rock concert, and roughly about, I think it was something about like 25 people were killed. And this was, I think it was something about the French having provoked ISIS, or it might have been some other terrorist group, but it probably says also quite a lot about from the perspective of the French, and how they are not exactly going to be bullied by terrorism and stuff like that. And also, you may also argue that if they hadn't, this sort of thing wouldn't have come about. But whilst all these, while we could always play the blame game about whether or not anything would have made any sort of difference, it is also worth mentioning that the sort of reception the French actually received after they had their match. touching, ladies and gentlemen, because again, can you just see this man here? Now, I know that for those sort of roughly under the age, if there's anybody here who's roughly about under the age of 15, and you don't know who this man is, this Frenchman here, this is Arsene Wenger. He was renowned as perhaps the greatest football manager that Arsenal had ever seen. To give an example of this, ladies and gentlemen, the 2003 to 2004 season, Arsenal went undefeated. I believe that was the story, but I know I've heard a lot of stories about that, so I'm going to go on the line of they were undefeated throughout an entire season. I can't recall any other team in history of football to have ever done that. Not even Alex Ferguson could muster something like that. And Sir Alex Ferguson is renowned probably up there with Keegan and Bobby Charlton as some of the greatest managers the world has ever seen in football. But, and I don't know whether it was just because Wenger just so happened to be here at the time, but it's the fact that everybody came together in this. Everybody was had each other's backs. Everybody knew exactly what the situation was. They knew what happened was tragic, and it was an attack on the French. There was no doubt about that. And it was even during the time when so many people on social media were having their banners on Facebook to portraits of the French flag, and actually how above and beyond the British actually did in doing stuff like this. Because you have to understand, it's a very different world we live in, and actually, probably if people said if this was like 1970 or something like that, that this sort of thing would never happen. Or rather, people would not go to this extent to both sing La Marseillaise, or to even have an entire section of the crowd at Wembley with the French flag. Which brings me into something of a very interesting little question of just in terms of like how we can end this one way or another. Is that, does this technically make La Marseillaise the greatest national anthem of all time? Because let's think about this as well. And, well, there is also one other way I want to conclude this. But before we get to this, there is just a few other things I want to say in terms of just how we can end all of this off. So because a historical context, its influence throughout the rest of Europe, its influence throughout the rest of history, it's recognizable immediately. Its melody is pitch perfect. Its sphere of influence in modern day politics, not just in France, but around the world, is nothing to deny about. The fact that the rest of the world will be willing to actually stand by the French, and actually the fact that the La Marseillaise has caught on so heavily around the world, and the fact that I've talked about it at nauseum as well. You can say whether or not this makes any difference whatsoever, but it's, when it comes to like national anthems in terms of what they stand for and what they are supposed to mean through and through, I would say La Marseillaise, you know what, is the best. I think it is the best because of just all the reasons I've listed above. And in that form, ladies and gentlemen, it would be very, very fitting if we actually closed out this video by listening to La Marseillaise one more time. This time done at the proms as far back as 2016. So let's have this one play us out. one more thing, just a very quick thing, just want to pause it at. There are people that would, if like God Save the King was on, would probably run out here and protest and stuff like that. But people were standing up in their seats to this. And I don't think I can recall any other occasion where La Marseillaise has ever been interrupted, because in the name of democracy, in the name of the French, and in the name of prosperity, of equality, of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it stands head and shoulders, possibly above the rest. Better than all the rest, I should say. So, thank you so much again, ladies and gentlemen, for taking a little bit of a contextual look as to, or rather a very objective look as to why La Marseillaise is the greatest national anthem of all time. And I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.